Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you all for coming to the third international workshop on Structural Macroeconomic Research Group. I'm glad to open this section dealing with the supermultiplier, and I will be the first one to present my paper. My paper is on shifting perspective, looking at the labor side in a Higgs-Rafa supermultiplier. And my co-author is the Emeritus Professor at the University of Brasília, Professor Joanilo Rodolfo Teixeira. Thank you. So, what is our motivation? Well, so first, we have to think about the labor market. Usually, post-Keynesians does not consider the interaction between the capital side and the labor side. Their reasons are related to the perfectly elasticity of labor supply, and which was established by Lewis in 1954. Besides these questions, we have from the entrepreneur side the recent development of artificial intelligence and the advancements in technology, not only facilitating labor activity, increasing productivity, but it is a perfect substitution for workforce. Different from the past 30 years, when the advancements in technology only was a savings labor force, now we have a perfect substitution for human workforce. In this case, our problem does not deal with the supply labor side, but with the demand labor side. Why? Because the entrepreneurs will not have to hire any work. It is a problem related to the firms and not to the workers. In this case, in this vein, we choose to look at the demand for labor to understanding how the economy works and how the income distribution will be affected. In this vein, the effects are not on the labor supply, but directly on the labor demand, restricting the power of any labor union and eliminating class conflict by struggling with the possibility of workers' defense. In this case, we have a huge problem, because the labor union usually stands on the labor side, and if the labor union does not have any power to bargain their wages, in this case, the entrepreneurs will eliminate the capitalist society by only what matters to capitalists and eliminating the workforce. So, the justification. For us, the wage elasticity of labor demand measures the sensitivity of employment to change in wages. This is a current or a traditional definition for wage elasticity of labor demand. This concept is central to the allocation of workforce on the productivity side. Recent technological advances have replaced employed people, at least in its formal sense, especially those less qualified. but not strictly to less qualified. In the last year, we have an human surgery at the John Hopkins University without human contact. Only machines developed a surgery at this university. And now, in this year, at the University of São Paulo, we also had another surgery without human contact, only with machines. So this is not strictly to less qualified. This also affects the high qualified workers. Today, we have some machines that not only answer phones and deliver simple human interactions like sales, but also perform surgeries without human help. This is to reference if you want to proceed with the literature. The percentage of high quality work is small, and the most sensitive part is the lower skilling, thus affecting the labor demand and wages, as pointed out by Schwab and Castellassi. In this vein, not only less skilled are affected, but also people with high skills. The central discussion here is that the dynamic of U, the capacity utilization rate, will define the trajectory of the investment, and in a long-run perspective, actual capacity utilization converges to its normal level, resulting in the steady state. In our case, we are dealing with a super multiplier type of model. So our investment share is an accelerator mechanism, and this accelerator mechanism is related to the difference between the capacity utilization, the actual capacity utilization, and the desired capacity utilization, or the normal capacity utilization. And the convergence of the actual capacity utilization to the normal capacity utilization will define the steady state in this case. So our capacity utilization is truly and only restricted by the growth rate of the autonomous consumption component. For us is the autonomous consumption and the exports. Second, by the investment share, the super multiplier, and our wage elasticity of labor demand, represented by EL, and also by the growth rate of wages. So in this case, for the first time, as we know, or as we saw, our research stands, we have an wage elasticity of labor demand, incorporating the labor market to a Hicks-Rafa type super multiplier type of model. The second equation is this of the system incorporates the wage elasticity of labor demand to its dynamics, and in this case, is tightly influenced by the labor market. In this case, we have the labor market incorporating in this kind of model, which is our central contribution in our paper. The proposition 1. The proposition 1 established the stability condition in a Hicks-Rafa supermultiplier, considering our incorporation of the labor demand. In this case, considering the impact of the labor market in a Hicks-Rafa supermultiplier, here after HSSM type of model, and assuming that the elasticity is an important factor to determine the convergence of the capacity utilization to its normal level. Thus, we can guarantee the stability of the approach if and only if the elasticity of labor demand be strictly restricted by the supermultiplier factor, by the advancement in technology, here represented by the capital output ratio, and on the other hand, by the increasing of real wages. In our case, the wage elasticity of labor demand will be restricted by the increasing real wages. So if we have higher wage growth rate, we will be able to consider a higher level of the wage elasticity of labor demand. So our proposition 2, considering the above system, the stable limit cycle stands if the same first condition is established. In this case, we cannot be higher than the difference between 3 and the value of the supermultiplier. In this case, we have a condition that we have a limit cycle, but this limit cycle is not unstable. This limit cycle is stable, which is different than which was established by Jivonsky and others in the structural change of economic dynamics, and another paper published in Macroeconomica. So we approach a numerical simulation to understand how the economic behave in this kind of situation. In the first case, if we consider the wage elasticity of labor demand perfect elastic, we have a situation of a chaos. We don't have a crucial solution. We have we don't have a solution. We have infinite solutions, but we don't have a solution here. If you flexibilize the wage elasticity of labor demand, only a few flexibilization, we will have a convergence to the normal capacity utilization. Therefore, our convergence will not be highly stable, and we will demonstrate a much I forgot the word devagar, a much slower convergence to the normal capacity utilization. The third case, we have the wage elasticity of labor demand equals 1. So unit elasticity. In this case, our convergence will be faster, but will be really faster. And in the final case, if our wage elasticity of labor demand is on the top, on the higher level established here, equals to 4, our convergence will be smoother, and we will hit the normal capacity utilization. In this vein, we demonstrated the speed adjustment of U and also of A. In the first case, we don't have a solution. The second case, as I presented it, it's really slower. In the third case, it's faster. And in the fourth case, it's smoother. And this fourth case will be the most efficient one. So what is our results and our concluding mark? First, we introduced the labor market into the Higgs-Raffin supermultiplier, which is our major accomplishment because in our research, we did not found another paper which introduced the labor market into this kind of model. Second, the development of new formulation considering the implication of wage elasticity and labor demand and the growth rate of average wage. We also introduced the growth rate of average wage, which will be looking at to the real wage side. This new assumption makes it possible to the study of the interaction between labor and capital in a long-term productivity function affects the determination of capital accumulation and the convergence of capital utilization to its normal level. This is an interesting conclusion because if we consider the growth ratio of average wage, we can flexibilize this condition and include other variables like government, the universal basic income, and the others, and other considerations, other assumptions to expand our approach. The third consideration is our approach shows that labor is restrictive statement science. The equilibrium in the limit cycle depends on the level of elasticity. And it is interesting that our limit cycle is stable and not unstable, which differs from Scott in 2016 macroeconomics paper, which established a Herodian instability. Our paper demonstrates that we don't have an unstable condition, so we don't have a Herodian instability in this case. Our model is perfectly stable. And fourth, our paper raises additional questions about this kind of restriction, such as, what happens if we restrict the labor side? What happens if we consider that we have a restriction in the labor side, in the labor market, but from the labor side, considering a much smaller amount of labor in comparison that the entrepreneurs need? It is possible to consider a minimum wage level of wage in our model to understand the implications of universal basic income in this kind of approach. As I mentioned before, we can improve our model, we can expand our model, introducing this assumption into the growth rate of average wages. How much the advancement in technology will affect the demand for workers? How much the advancement in technology can substitute labor? How much the advancement in technology and in artificial intelligence can substitute the humans workers? What do we have to do to avoid a higher level of unemployment if an extreme result we suppose technology substitutes all the workforce, all or even almost? We don't need all the workforce being substituted, but if you have a high level of substitution, what happens with the economy? How we will deal with this? How the economy will provide income for the unemployed people? So in this case, we have a lot of questions raised by such a paper. This is the reference presented in the paper, in the slides, not in the paper. The paper we have much more reference. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that we'll continue with the presentations, and at the end of the three presentations, we will open for the questions and answers section. The next presentation is by, just a moment. Just a moment, let me see on the schedule. The schedule. Let me see. Just wait, please. The internet is really is not great. And the next presentation. Next presentation will be the paper assessment of possibility economic alignment between G20 nations with a special focus on India, G7 and G12 nations, a general equilibrium analysis by Professor Somesh Kumar Mathur. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Greetings to all the participants here. This is a paper entitled Assessment of Possible Economic Alignment between G20 nations with special focus on India, G7 and G12 nations, a general equilibrium analysis. I am Professor Somesh K. Mathur from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, which is 450 kilometers south of Delhi. And my collaborators are Archana Sirvastav from BITS Pilani, Hyderabad, then Rachna Mathur, and Professor Prabir De of the RIS Ministry of External Affairs. So this is the work on the G20 nations. As you may be knowing, that it comprises of 7 developed nations, and the rest, 12 of them are some developing, most of them developing, Russia, and Oceania nations, that is Australia and New Zealand. We give some background of the G20 nations just to communicate that G20 is of great economic value and is of strategic importance to the G20 nations. Given the new geopolitical reality, G20 has assumed importance. The role of G20 has been changing. Earlier, it would address the issue of financial crisis, especially the 2008 financial crisis and the 1997 Asian flu. And then subsequently, the focus went on to pandemic hit economies, how to deal with such economies. And now the focus is on sustainable development goals and multilateral development banks, and its focus on alleviating poverty and unemployment across nations. About the G20 nations, as you may be knowing, that around 85% of the world GDP, that is around if the world GDP is around 94 trillion US dollars, 85% of it is attributed to G20 nations. Out of the world trade of 44 trillion, around 32 trillion trade is among G20 nations. 67% of the population is in the G20 nations. 60% of the land area is in the G20 nations. So G20 has its economic value. And here we spell out, it's there in the paper, all the background related to population, trade, and the economic assessment of the G20. If you look at the tariff profiles of the G20 nations, if you look at this table, G7 importing from G7 nations, if you look at the average right at the bottom, you can see it's meager 2.622%. G12 importing from G12, it's little higher, it is 5. But if you talk about India's import from these regional groupings, the tariffs are higher. They are at around 18% for the G12 nations and 22% for the G7 nations. So when it comes to the developing nations, it seems that they are the ones who are imposing higher tariffs on products coming from abroad. And the products which the developing countries are protecting are grains and crops and processed food and meat products. So it's pretty clear that the tariffs are higher in the developing part of the G20 nations, comprising of Mexico, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil. Brazil has an average tariff of 8%. We have an average tariff of 18%. If you look at the developed nations, and if you look at the non-tariff barriers, the non-tariff barriers, to our surprise, are higher in the European nations, in Saudi Arabia, and in China as compared to the developing nations. So we've got this inequity where we impose high tariff rates, but the developed part imposes higher non-tariff barriers. Okay, and non-tariff barriers are SPS, TBT, pre-shipment, inspection, quantitative restrictions, price restrictions, and so on, trips, trims. This paper is not focused on the NTBs, but that is the essence, that in Europe, in China, in Saudi Arabia, the non-tariff barriers are higher. So what we pose in this paper, we've got the whole lot of literature on the assessment of G20, and it seems from most of the studies that they realize the importance of G20 in addressing issues related to climate change and climate finance, and also importantly, monetary and financial issues. And they put it under two different heads. One is the Sherpa head, and the other is the finance. The finance head is also called the Sherpa head. And then you have the other head, which deals with the economic. So the economic issues, one part, the other is the financial and monetary issues. That is dealt in the G20. So, and then what is to be seen is that the issues related to regulations regarding investment treaties, digital connectivity, trade facilitation has assumed importance in the formation of the regional trade agreements. So the question that we pose the question that we pose is that futuristically, if we have to assess which policies are the best for G20 nations, we use the general equilibrium model of GTAP to do these simulations. We have 6 policies that we employ in our simulations. One is tariff liberalization, another is non-tariff liberalization. The third is movement of factors of production. The fourth is GVCs, global value change, enhancing value added due to technological progress. And then shipping technologies, because 90% of the world trade is done by ships. So we do these simulation scenarios. I want to show one slide on the simulation scenarios. If you look at the simulation scenarios that we do, we have G7 standalone liberalization, G12 standalone liberalization, G20 standalone liberalization, G20 nations comprehensive liberalization. And then because we had India in our mind, so India's bilateral liberalization with G20, G7 and G12. And then we do something extra. We try to see whether protectionism, whether free trade, or whether export subsidies, which are good for the G20 nations, including Brazil. Is it protectionism by raising the tariff levels, which we have seen during the pandemic? Is it free trade policies, or is it export subsidies? Let me share the results right away. That as far as the last thing is concerned, for India, if you compare protectionism, free trade, and export subsidies, to our surprise, export subsidies gives maximum welfare and growth for India. Now, this is WTO inconsistent, but still we are finding this result. Reason being that it seems that India is scarce in natural resource and land, unlike Brazil. So these export subsidies are like the industrial policies which tend to support the technological progress in energy systems, in manufacturing and transport and communications. So this is some result in variance with the common literature that we find, that if you compare free trade, protectionism, and export subsidies, we are finding something unnatural. Export subsidies tend to promote higher growth, which is WTO inconsistent. For Brazil, it seems that protectionism is giving the highest growth rates as compared to free trade policies and as compared to the export subsidies. So it seems that Brazil, when it raises the tariff rates, it tends to increase the returns to the land. The grains and crops and meat products is the sector which grows along with the domestic investment. This is our assessment sitting in India about Brazil. So these are result in variance with the common convention that probably free trade policies are good. Free trade policies are good only from welfare point of view, only that the welfare is ubiquitous, but protectionism tends to, and export subsidies in case of India tends to raise our growth rates more, but it is skewed. Only few get the benefits, not the others. So this is about our the last assessment. But when it comes to the other assessment, and this is the GTAP model that we use, for G7 and G20 nations, it seems that global value chains gives the highest welfare. And then for G7 and G20, movement of factors of production is giving us higher growth rate as compared to other standalone measures. For G12 nations, Brazil and India, it seems industrial policy of output-oriented technological progress in manufacturing and transport and communication is giving us higher growth rates. So these are these two broad results that we are getting from our work. And the methodology that we use is GTAP. It is a set of simultaneous nonlinear equations which we solve. And GTAP is that if you give a shock to one variable, what will happen to the entire economy-wide variables, including carbon emissions. So it has the set of macro equations, behavioral equations, and it has parameters. And the language which is used is GEMPACK to solve this nonlinear simultaneous equations. Sraffa and Johannesson were the first set of people who solved this general equilibrium model, because general equilibrium, as you know, is about consumers maximizing utility, producers maximizing profits, and then the markets match, that is demand is equal to the supply. And these are applied general equilibrium. There is GTAP, there is GTAP energy environment variant, there is land usage, and so on and so forth. So these set of results we find, and to our surprise, bilateral liberalization in G20 is better than a free trade formation among the G20 nations, because the benefits that you get by bilaterally liberalizing are higher. And as I've already told you, the paper finds out that WTO inconsistent policies of protectionism and export subsidies are giving higher welfare and growth rates for at least India and Brazil, and for the G11 nations. So this is what we find out, and we also compare free trade with protectionism both ways. Now, in that case, free trade is better than protectionism both ways. And we have put these results in the diagrammatic form. You can see the results so that these are some. So because of this time, so my last slide would be, so what sort of economic agenda should be discussed in G20 meetings? And what we say is that besides tariff and non-tariff liberalization, one needs to talk about movement of factors of production, and then bring in industrial policy in tandem with the trade policy, and an industrial policy of a different form, not the PLI scheme like India, which follows, which is like a subsidy, production subsidy. It's like output and input oriented technological progress, and then shipping technologies. And then in G20, strengthening of GVCs are quite important. So during PM Modi's visit to US, there was a lot of collaboration on technological transfers. There was talk about GVCs, especially related to supply chain management, and then movement of factors of production. So this is the paper that we spell out the priorities of different policies in G20 and which policies tend to favor the nations more. Right, and these are the references. Yeah, thank you so much.
And now I invite Professor Orivan Ibiapina da Silva to present his paper on monetary policy Carcará. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm sorry, I am not fluent in English, so I will have to read. Monetary policy Carcará. This region for writing this article comes from the song Carcará, authored by John do Vale from Maranhão, the Direito Unit of the Brazil, and shined in the voice of Maria Bethânia at the opening show in 1964 in Rio de Janeiro, having even served to leverage the singer's career. This is a music in English. Se tiver tempo, eu vou pedir para o Daniel colocar a música no final. The music praises the figure of the Carcará, a Brazilian breed of prey, which does well at the time. In the summer, it eats the animals killed in the forests, promoted by the Northwest farmers to clear the land for planting. In winter, the time of birth of the baby goats and baby sheep, the Carcará usually kills and eats the newborns. In the Northwest region of Brazil, the local population considers that there are only 2 seasons of the year, summer and winter. But why do I introduce an economist article with this verse? Because I allow myself to make an analogy. Born in Sweden, is Brazil in recession since 2014. baby goods, and baby ships, is Brazil that tries to react. And Carcará symbolizes the monetary policy of our central bank, which is traders our hubs. Quarterly monetary policy has one of its most important functions to control inflation, toward the management of the interest rate, a way to stimulate or repress consumer demand for goods and services. That is, inflation is defined as reaction to demand greater than supply, which means regulating the level of economic activity. This action is supported by theory in which was called the inflation targeting regime, followed by the Central Bank of Brazil, BCB, since July 1999, with the following modus operandi. This means that the central bank must raise the nominal interest rate every time there is an increase in inflation expectations, and that I must reduce the nominal interest rate every time there is a reduction in expected inflation. Between September 2020 and February 2021, the Selic rate target was around 2% per year. The levels for remuneration of national treasury bonds associate with profitability according to the international standard. The national average is 13.25% per year. Calculated using monthly data going back to 1996, while 10 years US Treasury bonds having an average return of 5.11% per year. Calculated using annual data from 1928 to 2021. For a short period, 2012 to 2021, the average drops to 2.59% per year. In this context, early 2021, our financial rentiers began working to return rising interest rates, or with articles in the specialized press, not by financial market agents. It so happened that, on top of all the arguments expressed by the financial market lobby, there were technical defensive positions in a diverse sense, expressed at the time. Let's introduce them. Na coluna da esquerda, vamos ter o discurso que foi implantado a partir de 2021 para aumentar os juros pelo Copom. E do lado esquerdo eu vou colocar os argumentos técnicos contrários que existiam na época, mas que o Banco Central não seguiu. The BCB overreacted in reducing interest rates in 2020, resulting in a rising long-term interest rate compared to the short-term interest rate, more steep interest curve. Since the market, influenced by the government's fiscal imbalance, estimated a rising future Selic rate. The increased inflation between November 2020 and February 2021 would increase the risk of the not reaching the target for 2021. The Brazilian yield curve would not derive from the expectation of an increase in the public debt. In period of crisis, it was to expected, não dá para ver ali, and the relax fiscal, as the USA and Europe did. But wide interest rates were not expected in the short term or long-term interest curve of these economies. The long-term interest rate compared to the short term rose from the second half of 2020 in Brazil, not because of risk of default or the treasury debt, but one, expectations of high interest rates in the long term produced by the BCB and itself. The access on the Bolsonaro government may have posed a much greater risk to foreign investment. Orelha, 2022. The rise in inflation at the time was a response to a supply shock caused by the rise in commodity prices on the international market, fueled by the disruption of production and distribution chains and as a result of the pandemic. Thus, it's caused not by combated by raising interest rates, which only affect demand pressures. In this perspective, some countries that adopt the target regime have subtracted from the calculation of the inflation index price subject to supply shocks. Our BC, however, has not made adjustment to the IPCA to determine the inflation target, which would run the expected results. Side effects. In the effort to lower inflation, the BCB could consider its side effects is the case of the retraction in economic activity, which has been in recession since 2014, Bernard Swindes, as well as the worsening of the fiscal situation with the increase in debt service. In this context, Professor José Luiz Oreiro was blunt. There is not empirical evidence available that points to an expansionary effect of an increase in the short-term interest rate on the level of economic activity, when the economy operates with a wide degree of the idleness of production factor. That is, to the crisis, the Brazilian economy operated with idle capacity. Therefore, it was isolated to represent non-existent demand. Despite the report theoretical constitution, in March 2015, the BCB monetary policy preferred to adhere to the arguments of the financial market aroused in United and upward climbing the Selic rate, slash until the present. Ou seja, quando o Banco Central começou a subir a taxa de juros, foi a despeito de toda a argumentação técnica contrária que existia à época, né? Apesar de todo o mercado financeiro ter um discurso supostamente técnico, que na realidade é técnico, existiam outros argumentos técnicos também que o Banco Central poderia usar para não começar a subida dos juros, né? Que na época estava em 2% e hoje está nos notáveis 13,75% ao ano, que é, segundo as revistas especializadas, a maior taxa de juro nominal do mundo. According to the previous table, the Selic rate target green 587.6% in the period. In other words, turning the blind eye into the long ground of the economy since 2014, Bernard Swindes, e failing to promote and recover baby ships. The BCB's monetary policy, Carcará monetary policy, intensified the recessive policy. A gravura, eu destaco que quais são as variáveis que o Banco Central trabalha, né, quando vai na reunião do Copom. Inflação, contas públicas, atividade econômica e o cenário internacional. Esses dois aqui o Banco Central desconsidera, né? A atividade econômica do Brasil na época estava ruim, né? PIB baixo, e o cenário internacional era um cenário de pandemia, ou seja, a inflação podia ter causa em outros fatores, como a gente vai ver. No artigo eu detalho isso mais com maior profundidade, nos slides faz um resumo, mas o fato é que, no cenário internacional, apontava para que a inflação tivesse outras causas, e não a inflação de demanda, e é o que é natural se combater com taxa de juros. Em torno, the increase in interest rates, good net debt service, and the accumulated those months until February 2022, the Brazilian state spends 422.5 billion in real, 4.78% of GDP, with interest payments to banks and rentiers, and the preview those maps, that is until February 2021, it was 216.5 billion de reais. Therefore, the new stance to monetary policy increased financial sector revenue by more than 100 billion de reais. And once the substance of Carcará. According to XP Investments projection, carried out on 23 de março de 2023, maintaining the salary rate and 13.75% until the end of the year will lead to the payment of 813 billion euros in interest, equivalent to 7.7% on the GDP. Highest proportion since 2016. Ou seja, mantendo essa taxa de juros até o final do ano, a gente vai pagar só de juros 813 bilhões de dólares, o que corresponde a 7,7% do PIB. Perdão, corresponde a 7,7% do PIB, que encosta no teto dessa porcentagem do PIB, que era o que a última vez que aconteceu foi em 2016. Final considerations. The BCB's monetary policy, by not caring about the side effects in causa, acted like Carcará, which has no qualms about the devastated land and the future on the ship. After all, you can always fly to the outer lands, perhaps tax haven. Eu vou pedir para o Daniel, dá para colocar o vídeo agora? Está sem áudio, Daniel.
Last day, it's like all the people who come from outside the village or people outside the village. We don't act your indicators and your approach. Because here is the country that would actually the huge responsibility from the point of view of being able to go on explanation. We don't have to run something there. In fact, our attention is very large importance. We are very and you have Very people are making education, where we are not they don't know how they get education. Next, they all have to be that. I am saying, it doesn't this so the next thing when you were and we are buying fish. It's a very good one, and that's the minute it is work and very well. Now, all you do is a very nice problem. And so all the things you can where you don't and a lot of topic is very good. Because you know how this investment can do. Right. They create construction, they provide the meetings, they provide demand, they give the benefits. And that's very good. You have to pay to do that. You don't have to do that either. You can spend much more on it. Probably. And that's really important that we really want. Yes, sir. Yes, I would speak for how.
Ok. Resumindo, existem evidências teóricas e práticas de que a política monetária do Banco Central, ela se porta como carcará. Né? O carcará é a ave que ela sobrevive em época de situações ruins no Nordeste. Quando a queima das roças, ele come os bichos queimados. E no inverno, ele come os carneiros e os cabritos recém-nascidos. Então, quando você aumenta o juro em situação de PIB baixo, como estava o Brasil naquela época, e você mantém hoje essa situação, quando o país quer crescer e a taxa de juros alta o impede, é que motivou a comparação com o carcará. Então, era isso que eu queria passar para vocês. Thank you. Obrigado, gente. Até a próxima.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor. I invite now, Professor, to the questions and answers section. I don't know how to spell your name, Professor. Professor Martu, please come to the chair. So we are open to the questions and answers. If you have any questions, please present them. Okay. So wait, we have a little time. We have a few time to presenting the questions and then make the cough break, and then the Professor Carmen Feijó will speak to us. I will choose three or four questions only, please, to be presented to the professors and for me. So
my question is to you.
Can't hear
According
you.
according to PASNET, the only thing that we can say for sure is that will be structural change. But Thurrow's model, considering that no matter how much structural change take place, we still have to employ lower skilled people to bind the machines. So I like to know how do you consider the fiscal effects? Yeah, because the government will incentive educations, will be adopted education's policy. And how do you work around the problem of the lower skilled peoples? Because I think they will be work at some time.
Okay. More questions?
I have a question. I'll ask Professor
Martu?
Matu.
First, I would like to say that it's a pleasure to receive you here in Brazil. I hope you are enjoying. Second, I would like to ask you. I saw that you used GTAP 10. I'm really not familiar with the most contemporary number of GTAP, but I would like to ask you if this data already takes into consideration the recent changes in international trades due to the war in Ukraine, and if not, if you could please say what do you think that has changed? I think India has been playing a big role in this mess nowadays. And I would also like to ask you if the model that you use is Australian type, linearized, and if you have other works on this, taking into consideration only groups of liberalization, not only G7, but for example, just Brazil and India in regards to the rest of G20, or India and China, or India, Russia, China, South Africa, and Brazil, the BRICS countries. And okay, this is my question.
More questions? No? Anyone? No? So I will be polite and I will ask you to answer this question first.
Okay, thank you so much for this question. So his question was that these geopolitical realities like the Ukraine-Russian war, can that be accounted by this GTAP model? Let me first give you some background of the GTAP model, because that was another part of your question. It considers around 120 regions, 120 countries and 20 regions around the world. Okay. All in all, 224 countries are considered with 65 broad sectors. And because it's a general equilibrium model, we have these equations which define the economy. And as I said, these are macro equations, they are behavioral equations, and then these elasticities and parameters are also system driven. So what GTAP does is that if you change one of the variables, for example, in case of Brazil, when I was coming, I wanted to see what's good for Brazil. Is it protectionism? Is it trade policy, free trade? Or is it export subsidies? To our surprise, we found that protectionism is one-way protectionism, that if you start raising the tariff rate, that is giving the higher growth rates. But I want to add that this is WTO inconsistent. Free trade policies, although they give lower growth rates, but the welfare is higher and it is much more spread around. Now, as far as numbers that you asked, how do you get these numbers? Say, welfare. GTAP gives numbers to around 80 variables which define the economy, starting from welfare, much broader, broadly defined, welfare decomposed into, and welfare in terms of that microeconomic concept of equivalent variation. One is compensation variation, another is equivalent variation. That given the prices and incomes today, if you have to achieve next level of prices and incomes, how much do you give your income or take back your income so that you reach the newer levels of utility? That is how they define welfare, decomposed into allocative efficiency, investment savings, endowments, technology effect, terms of trade effects, and others. Okay? This is how they define welfare. And there has to be an equation to get the value. And they work on the indirect utility functions to get these values. About Russia-Ukraine war and its disruptions all around, it can be worked out using the GTAP model. But here you have to first see which sectors would get impacted the most. And if the sanctions have to come, which sector would get impacted the most. So people think that natural resource, if you put sanctions on natural resource sector, it would harm Russia the most. But through GTAP model, we found that if you do sanctions on manufacturing and services sector, that harms them more than these sanctions on natural resource. So this can be worked out, environmental policies can be worked out, tax systems and its impact on the economy can be worked out. And that most important part of your question, India, Brazil, India, BRICS liberalization, then like we've done around 10,000 simulations. India's liberalization with all economies of the world, where does it get the maximum benefit? Or Brazil, where does it get the maximum benefit if it wants to align with the outside world? All this can be done. Like our work, which is published in UNESCAP, is on Indo-Pacific Economic Alliance, India's alliance with 46 member nations. But the subset of APTA is, the subset of Indo-Pacific Alliance, 46 nations, is Asia-Pacific Trade Alliance, BIMSTEC, ASEAN, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. All this can be worked out simultaneously, both ways. And then you're not only, I'll just take 1 minute more.
Okay.
You can not only do tariff liberalization, but non-tariff liberalization, capital movement, skilled labor movement, then GVCs, global value chains, where you're talking about value-added enhancement. Then you can talk about shipping technologies. Then you can talk about service sector liberalization. And this is only comparative strategy, 2 equilibrium positions. Some better models can talk about dynamic relationship, that if you want to reach from one equilibrium to another equilibrium, there is this dynamic GTAP. And then there is energy environment variant of GTAP, which talks about that how does sectoral and economic policies have an impact on economy-wide variables and carbon emissions. So think, if Brazil has all these sectors, which sectors tend to have higher carbon emissions? UN says that it's only production which is responsible. Using GTAP, because it has both production and consumption data, you will see that it is the service sector which is giving you higher emissions. So accordingly, you can set up your policies. So whole gamut of things. Unfortunately, in our textbooks, we only talk about partial equilibrium analysis, not general equilibrium. So one has to refer to Hurtel's book, which is like a Bible for GTAP, and then whole lot of work which has followed the Hurtle's work on applied general equilibrium model, starting from Australian Oriani, Salter work, and then subsequently Thomas Hurtle in the Purdue University. They were the ones who took it up, put the codes, put the input-output tables of every country, and then worked out the general equilibrium impact. But I would love to talk more about this, but given the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Sure.
Professor. Answering your question, Pazinetti's structural change model usually takes in development and advanced economies in comparison. So I wrote a paper and published it with Rafael Cipresti in the PSL quarterly review about the implications of labor productivity on the structural change models. And in our vision, the common sense stands that advancements in technology will provide a substitution to labor forces. So in our case, and in the case of this paper, the most important view here is that artificial intelligence could impose a perfect substitution to human workforce. And in this case, the economy will be in a chaos situation also. So for us, in futures papers, for me and for Professor Juanillo, we will try to understand how the government could provide a better situation to the labor unions and the workforce as all, and how the advancements in technology and artificial intelligence could be a problem to our entire economy and the distribution of income. The case of the fiscal policy is the last question that I presented. In our case, if we introduce the university basic income, which is remarkably an assumption proposed by Suplicy in São Paulo, we will have the tools to guarantee an income for all. But this income will be a lower income. It will not be a middle income. It will be a lower income, and the workers will have to continue to improve their skills and to be allowed to work in great industries or other firms. In this case, I think that if the artificial intelligence continue to advance, we will have something like Lenin wrote in the end at the 19th century, named the worker revolution. We will tend to this kind of situation, which is not good. It's a revolution, so many people will die, and we will have a lot of problems with this kind of situation. But the government could provide this type of income using fiscal policy to avoid, or at least reduce the risks to a labor revolution. I answer you, okay? Okay. We have more questions? Someone? Okay. Beatriz?
I like to make a question to the second presentation. Professor, if we consider that here in Brazil, the substitution process and protections walk together in the policy. But here we are undeveloped, so we use to copy the technology of the developed countries. So we don't have the means to create products with high elasticity hand of exports. So how do you lead with this? And I like to know, probably the sector of the energy will cause impact in the price. Professor Margling make a book about this, Raising Canes, talking that the energy has a lot of impact in the inflation. And in equilibrium general, we consider prices. So this will impact the prices in this case?
Okay.
I have a question too, Professor Orivan, sorry. In your presentation, you presented a table considering the interest rate in Brazil. And yesterday, Professor José Luiz Oreiro comment that the interest rate in Brazil, the higher level of interest rate in Brazil, is struggling the income distribution and deteriorating our industrialization. I would like to know if this is also your view once you are dealing with non-traditional literature, or if you do have an alternative for monetary policy in this kind of situation. Quer que fale em português? Sim? Você apresentou lá no seu trabalho, I only will translate to Portuguese to him. Você apresentou no seu trabalho uma tabela lá que considerava as taxas de juros, certo? Ontem o professor José Luiz Oreiro, ele falou na abertura dele com respeito às altas taxas de juros estarem deteriorando a distribuição de renda e a própria industrialização. Eu queria saber se você concorda com esse tipo de pontuação, uma vez que você trabalha com uma tradição, uma literatura não tradicional, ou se você teria uma alternativa para a economia monetária com relação a isso. So, as I will be polite again, please, Professor,
Yeah,
the most external professor.
Thank you for those questions, really good ones.
Just a minute, Professor. What? He has a question. Okay. More questions, because after this question we will have a coffee break, but if you have more questions, I will be happy to include.
Bom dia, a minha pergunta é para o professor Ivan.
Para quem?
Professor Ivan.
Orivan.
If you can translate to
Sim.
the other prophet.
Você pode falar em português e inglês se você quiser.
Não, tranquilo. Minha pergunta é sobre as metas de inflação. Se isso agora estão discutindo, né, sobre o possível aumento dessas metas de inflação. Eu queria saber se isso é uma possível solução para essa nossa taxa de juros que está tão alta. E se não for, quais são as outras possíveis soluções que nós podemos pensar para que ela possa efetivamente reduzir e que permaneça em níveis mais baixos para possibilitar a industrialização, enfim, o desenvolvimento econômico do Brasil.
Já traduzi para ele. Okay, let's start. Please, Professor.
Yeah.
And then...
So that's an interesting suggestion. In our paper, we have suggested that for G12 nations, which includes India and Brazil, it is output-oriented technological progress in manufacturing and transport and communications, which will help the cause of growth and development in these nations. I'll tell you an example. You have these mobile phones which you use for Pix. You can pay, like in India also. You have this UPI. You can easily have these transfers. But does it work across the nations? Do you have financial cooperation among the banks so that the technology is used so that I can use my mobile to pay in Brazil? If that can be possible, that is one way of having this soft technology which can help have a financial cooperation and growth and development all around. As far as energy systems are concerned, it is interesting to note that if you do some structural transformation exercise, wherein you introduce technological progress and you identify whether technological progress in capital, in skilled labor, in energy systems, in unskilled labor, in natural resource, which provides relatively higher growth and welfare and development. This GTAP allows you to study structural transformation. So we thought, or generally it is believed, that if you put in technological progress in skilled labor, there will be growth and development all around. But through GTAP, we found capital comes first, then comes energy system, whether it is coal, natural gas, whether it is petroleum or oil or renewables. Then comes your unskilled labor. That means if you invest in skilling the unskilled labor, it is good for the economy. Skilled labor comes second last, and the last is natural resource. So, and then what sort of technological progress I'm talking about? I'm talking about these 4 IR technologies, 4 industrial revolution technologies, be it automation, be it your driverless car, or be it biotechnology, nanotechnologies. All these, if you apply, our GTAP model shows that capital and energy systems can help you with growth and development. As far as prices are concerned, you know, when I was in Ecuador for some time, I used to learn about Brazilian example, where they had this carbon sequestration in the ocean. So this net zero emission targets that UN has decided, I think time has come for having these policies which not only talks about limiting carbon emissions, but should also talk about, you know, sinking of carbon sequestration. And in that way, you can take care of the scarcity. I know the issues because trading in natural resource is difficult. That is why we suggest an industrial policy related to natural resource. Like in India, we are scarce in natural resource and land. And therefore, we need an industrial policy to take care of it. So scarcity is a greater issue in India rather than in Brazil. So this is our suggestion based on the model. I have many more things to say, but they are coming from all over, which I shouldn't like to say all those the other things. But based on our work, this is what we.
Thank you, Professor. So now, Professor Ivan.
Eu vou ter que responder em português, né, pelos motivos já expostos. Com relação à industrialização, eu concordo com o professor Oreiro, né? Não tem como você movimentar a economia desse país, se reindustrializar, que é uma discussão paralela, né? Essa questão de reindustrialização é uma discussão que está tendo muito foco hoje no Brasil, porque há quem diga que a desindustrialização recente ela é natural e eu, como por exemplo, sou de opinião que ela não é, né? Ela é um processo nocivo para o atual estado que está a economia brasileira, que não pode ficar dependendo simplesmente de comercialização de commodities para crescer, né? Commodities só cobre 3% do PIB, 3 a 5% do PIB, emprega muito pouco, porque o nosso agronegócio é muito moderno, né? Tem uma produtividade altíssima, a melhor do mundo, tanto que os Estados Unidos há anos faz protecionismo de alguns produtos, né? Desde que eu fazia a faculdade na década de 80, final da década de 80, eu não sou tão velho assim, final da década de 80, início da década de 90, que se fala que a laranja produzida no Brasil, naquela época, era muito mais produtiva do que a dos Estados Unidos, mas eles faziam tarifas lá para proteger os produtores de laranja da Flórida. E esse é um processo que continua. Então, e diga-se de passagem, o nosso agronegócio é muito moderno por causa do subsídio que o governo sempre deu também e graças à pesquisa da Embrapa, que foi um órgão estatal que subsidiou conhecimento para o nosso agronegócio desde a década de 60. Então, a grande produtividade e o grande sucesso das nossas commodities no mercado internacional, na parte de agricultura, deve-se à participação do Estado. O Brasil praticamente não tem bancos privados de investimento, né? Antigamente tinha alguns bancos privados que financiavam grandes obras. Não sei se ainda tem, tinha o Banco Safra, tinha outros bancos que eram exclusivos bancos de investimentos. A legislação mudou na década de 90, nesse processo de financiarização, que esses bancos passaram a ser banco comercial também. Então, misturou com as atividades de comércio, crédito para os correntistas, etc. Então, esses bancos privados que faziam empréstimos de grande porte para investimento, acho que praticamente acabaram hoje. Então, o que sobra? Os bancos estatais e o BNDES. Porque o nosso sistema bancário privado, hoje, ele lucra muito na compra de títulos do governo e desses empréstimos para os correntistas, né? Crédito consignado, empréstimos cartão de crédito, são as maiores fontes de lucro. Então, ele não tem incentivo nenhum, os bancos privados, 5, 6 bancos privados que nós temos, para fazer investimento de grande porte, né? É uma discussão que a gente deveria ter em economia com relação a isso. Então, hoje, a nossa realidade é depender dos bancos públicos, né? E é interessante como na imprensa, você tem sempre uma imprensa técnica, supostamente técnica, que vai colocar argumentos contrários com relação a essa participação do Estado. Por exemplo, ontem eu vi no UOL um artigo do Arminio Fraga dizendo que e aí já vou entrar na questão das metas da inflação, que você perguntou, dizendo que aumentar a meta de inflação do Banco Central é suicídio. Suicídio por quê? Eu gostaria de saber por quê. Porque a meta, essa distância em relação à meta, é um incentivo para o Banco Central atuar mais, ou seja, juro mais alto, né? Então, notadamente, esses argumentos são gente do mercado financeiro, gente que atua lá dando consultoria e tal. Porque se eu aumentar a meta, a diferença entre Selic e meta diminui. Então, o Banco Central não teria tanta margem para aumentar os juros, né? É essa a discussão. E por que o pessoal do setor bancário defende isso, então? Como já comentou no artigo do professor Oreiro também, a conflito de interesses, né? Porque essa meta mais alta vai afetar a taxa Selic, né? Então, a gente tem que ter muito cuidado com aquilo que a gente lê e ser muito crítico ao que sai na imprensa, principalmente na imprensa técnica e econômica, né? A gente não tem muito espaço para colocar. Outro artigo que eu vi ontem também, ou foi anteontem, no Valor e na Folha, um economista lá que é colunista, formado em Yale, né, eles fazem questão de botar a titulação deles, e dizendo que ele discutindo lá, diz que já tem 2, 3 anos, dizendo que o empréstimo do BNDES não vai aumentar o investimento privado. Aí você vai ter vários modelos que eles colocam. O que eu sugiro é que a gente não aceite isso de pronto, né? Não olhe para o título de quem escreve, não olhe não se impressione com o modelo, faça a crítica. Porque se fosse levar em consideração isso, os anos que nós crescemos aqui no Brasil, né, se você fizer a história da economia brasileira, nós só crescemos quando? Quando o Estado participou, quando o BNDES participou, quando nós fomentamos a indústria de base, quando criamos a CSN para produzir aço, para estimular a indústria, nossa indústria de base, tudo com apoio de financiamento estatal e apoio do Estado, tá certo? Que tem demandado a participação privada. Então, com relação às metas, eu sou altamente a favor que se aumente a meta do Banco Central, né? Pelo impacto, como a minha apresentação é uma crítica à política monetária infringida atualmente pelo Banco Central, até porque a nossa média histórica de inflação não é essa, digamos, a meta hoje está em 3,25, né? Nossa média histórica de inflação nos últimos 15 anos está em torno de 6%. Que, aliás, é outro argumento para você dizer por que o Banco Central tem que ter essa taxa tão alta se hoje a inflação está 5,49%, que está abaixo da nossa média histórica. Ou seja, é a inflação que dá para trabalhar, que dá para conviver com ela. Tá certo? A impressão que a gente tem é que vocês não alcançaram isso, vocês são muito jovens, eu alcancei a nossa época de hiperinflação, na década de 80, né, que o preço subia todo dia. Isso deixou um certo... uma sensibilidade muito grande para a inflação, principalmente os técnicos do Banco Central. A inflação subiu um pouquinho, ele já se assombra, tem que aumentar juros. Então, existe toda uma teoria voltada para isso. A alta sensibilidade de quem comanda a política monetária com a inflação. E como eu vi naquele slide que eu coloquei, Copom, e também no meu artigo, e eu detalho muito isso, a questão da política monetária não pode se limitar a ver só a inflação, tem que ver a atividade econômica. O Federal Reserve fez isso, o Banco Central Europeu fez isso quando estava na crise. Quer dizer, há um limite para a atuação da política monetária, no sentido de que ela tem que olhar também para a produção. Juro alto, produção baixa. Juro alto, emprego menor. Então, isso, no meu artigo, eu falo lá citações do presidente do Banco Central americano, de economistas, Stiglitz, o próprio Woodruff, que é um economista que praticamente criou o regime de metas, ele fala lá eu coloquei uma citação dizendo, olha, a gente tem que tomar cuidado com a parte da inflação que é muito sensível a choques de oferta. Então, quando for analisar a inflação, olha isso, o que está contaminando essa inflação, porque senão o remédio pode matar o paciente. Ele não usou essas palavras, mas falou com outras, mas exatamente é isso. Com relação, outra coisa que eu queria chamar a atenção, em finanças públicas, a taxa Selic, ou as taxas dos títulos públicos, seja nos Estados Unidos, seja aqui, são taxas livres de risco. Por isso elas deveriam ser mais baixas. Nos Estados Unidos é assim. Se você pegar a média histórica dos T-bonds, dos T-bills, dos títulos americanos, ela é bem inferior à taxa do SP500, que é a taxa das ações das maiores empresas americanas. Você pega no site da Modaran, você baixa lá, você vai ver que os títulos públicos têm taxa média histórica muito inferior à rentabilidade da Bolsa. Aqui não. Aqui usa esse discurso de que para controlar a inflação, nós temos que ter a taxa livre de risco mais alta do mundo. Nós temos uma taxa livre de risco mais alta do mundo. Não tem risco nenhum de se pagar um título dos nossos títulos nacionais. Não tem. Nunca houve um default de título brasileiro. É o default de dívida externa, que não tem mais. Então, não faz sentido se colocar tanto peso na questão do default de título nosso aqui brasileiro. Tá certo? Então, é isso, gente. O Banco Central ele tem que preocupar também com a produção, com o país, com tudo que está acontecendo lá fora, entendeu? Com relação à nossa economia. Não pode se preocupar simplesmente com a inflação. E mesmo como eu coloquei no artigo, existem argumentos técnicos que mesmo essa tese de inflação ela pode ser rebatida tecnicamente, né? Basta ver os artigos do professor Oreiro aí, que ele coloca várias situações em que esses argumentos do Banco Central não são válidos. Obrigado.
Thank you, professors. Thank you for the audience. We are now finished the section, and I invite you all to enjoy our coffee break. In a few minutes, we will have the presentation, the Professor Carmen Feijó presentation here in this seminar. Thank you very much for coming and enjoy.
Você não foi bem, velho. I can send you by email. Yes, that. Okay, I can put. Right. Thank you.
Hello, let us start the section. Oi? Eu vou presidir. Tá aí? Ok. Ok, ok. Tá bom. So, my students, please behave. I'm looking to you. No, please, take a seat first. Well, good morning. We are starting our second keynote lecture of today. And I will present for you my dear friend, Professor Carmen Feijó from Federal University, Fluminense University in the city of Niterói at the state of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Well, Professor Carmen Feijó has her PhD in economics by the University College London. He had a master in economics. This artificial intelligence is a problem. No? Oh. She had a master in the same area, but with focus in production by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And also he's graduates also in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. From the 2-year period, 2008-2009, Professor Carmen Feijó was the executive secretary of the National Graduate Association of Economics, ANPEC. In September 2011, she assumed as the adjunct coordinator function in the area of economics at CAPES from 2010 to 2013. In the middle of 2012, the coordination of this area. Since 2015, she's the editor of the journal Cadernos do Desenvolvimento. I think that changes now. Yes, but she was the editor of the journal Cadernos do Desenvolvimento, which is a publication of the Celso Furtado International Center. She's a member of the International Statistical Institute since 1998, and she's also a professor of the Federal Fluminense University since 1992. She also worked as a researcher on IBGE, which is the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, until 2003. She had a large experience in the area of economics, with emphasis in post-Keynesian economics, researching mainly the following topics: economic growth, manufacturing industry, productivity, firm theory, and official statistics. Well, I invite now Professor Camille Feijó to take a seat. Please. Daniel. Now, put to the presentation. No, but thank you. Well, Professor Carmen Feijó, the floor is yours.
Okay, so. So, good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. And I'm very pleased to deliver this presentation here in the third workshop of Structuralism, Development Macroeconomic Research Group. And I wish to thank José Luiz Oreiro for this invitation and to chair this session. The paper I'm presenting contributes to the discussion on policy space for developing economies as it connects the determination of the exchange rate and the interest rate under the inflation target regime. I will bring theoretical and empirical arguments. I have an empirical exercise about this. So as inflation targeting regime has been adopted over 2 decades now, we gather enough statistical information to investigate the exchange rate trends of developed and developing economies under the inflation target regime. So let's recall that according to the new developmentalism, macroeconomic policy is seen as a critical factor explaining long-term growth differentials between countries. And the overvaluation trend of the exchange rate is seen as a fundamental obstacle for middle-income countries to carry out the catch-up strategy concerning the rich countries. So let me start with the motivation of the paper. The motivation of the paper, we observe that theoretical and empirical literature shows sound evidence that a competitive real exchange rate that is close to the real equilibrium level, but slightly undervalued, is key for economic development. However, maintaining a competitive and stable level for the real exchange rate depends on several factors, such as on countries' exchange rate policy, the monetary policy regime, the degree of capital openness. And under inflation targeting and a high degree of capital openness, the determination of the real exchange rate depends on the degree of autonomy of the monetary policy. So assuring a competitive real exchange rate depends on the ability with which policymakers coordinate monetary policy with the other spheres of macroeconomic policy, especially fiscal and exchange rate policy. So in my presentation, I will bring empirical evidence that the inflation target regime contributes to the overvaluation trend of the real exchange rate. Here we have the structure of the presentation. The paper seeks to provide 3 specific contributions. First, to reaffirm the importance of keeping a competitive real exchange rate to ensure a successful catching up trajectory in developing countries. Second, by taking into account the central role of a competitive real exchange rate for economic development, to analyze at the theoretical level the connection between monetary policy under inflation targeting and real exchange rate trend in economies highly open to capital flows. Third,
to provide empirical evidence on the long-term trend of the real exchange rate in select developed and developing economies, which manage their monetary policy under inflation targets. So in recent decades, several methodologies have been used to estimate the long-run equilibrium value of the exchange rate as a means to understanding whether this variable has followed an appreciation or depreciation trajectory over time. In the paper, we follow Roderick's methodology. So we build an equilibrium real exchange rate with the correction for the real exchange rate made through each country's per capita income, which is a proxy for capturing the Herod-Balassa Summerfield effect. So moving to our hypothesis, the hypothesis we want to test is that in a context of a high degree of openness to capital flows, developing countries under inflation targets tend to show an overvaluation trend of the currencies driven by a higher interest rate differential. Whereas in developed countries, the overvaluation trend is not necessarily explained by the monetary regime, but by the higher level of per capita income, which reflects, in turn, the high average labor productivity. In other words, since the overvalued trend in developed countries reflects their level of productivity, it's not harmful to their long-term economic performance. In the case of developing countries, on the other hand, the overvaluation trend is damaging because it reduces the productivity of tradable goods, especially those produced domestically and subject to international competition, as well as exportable goods. So by relocating part of the aggregate demand to imports, the overvaluation trend in developed countries also discourages investment and reduce economic growth as confirmed by empirical evidence. So there are plenty theoretical evidence and empirical evidence as well in favor of ensuring a competitive real exchange rate level for sustaining economic development. From the theoretical perspective, there are several channels through which a slightly undervalued currency sustains economic growth. First, increasing the relative price of tradable goods and services in comparison with the non-tradable. This tends to stimulate resource allocation to the former. The stimulus to the production of tradables under a competitive real exchange rate should stimulate investment and a derived demand in the non-tradable sector. Second, a competitive real exchange rate induces a structural change in a developing country over time by shifting resources from primary commodity manufacturing sectors to higher technologically sophisticated manufacturing subsectors. Third, the structuralist point of view, since these subsectors are characterized by dynamic economies of scale and have the highest potential to generate and spread technical progress to the economy as a whole, in the end, a competitive real exchange rate tends to boost productivity and economic growth. But that's the point, how to ensure and sustain a competitive real exchange rate level over time. This depends not only on the exchange rate regime, but also on the exchange rate policy. Gordon, for instance, argues that the choice of a particular regime is directly associated with a specific ends to be reached by the exchange rate policy. The traditional Mundell-Fleming model assures that if exchange rates float freely, it ensures balanced payment long-term equilibrium and allows monetary and fiscal policy to work independently to reach real targets, such as output growth and full employment. As we shall see, the interaction between inflation target regime and free capital movements narrows policy space for the autonomy of monetary policy, make it much more complicated to ensure the stability of real exchange rates unless government authorities introduce mix of exchange rate policy instruments such as exchange market interventions, macroprudential instruments, capital controls. So here you have the problem. So let's now bring the inflation target regime to the discussion. Let's recall the foundation of this policy, monetary policy. It's built on the neoclassical macroeconomic framework. In practical terms, inflation targets is a regime of monetary policy where central banks manipulate the policy rates to affect aggregate demand and overall economy. Thus, it's assumed that inflation and economic activity move together and that a slowdown of economic activity should bring the inflation rate down to the target. In the theoretical terms, it is assumed that the existence of an inflationary bias, that is, the monetary authority's incentive to create an inflationary surprise to reduce unemployment levels below its natural rate. The inflationary bias would occur because of the discretionary behavior of the monetary authority seeking to maximize the social welfare function at each moment in time. In this sense, the new classical theory builds arguments to sustain that the monetary authority's action should be based on rules to the detriment of discretion. Therefore, adopting a monetary rule would be a solution to minimizing the inflationary bias. An inflation target regime is understood then as a set of institutional norms and procedures that, based on the announcement of a numerical value for the inflation target, and assuming efficient mechanisms of transmission, would guide rational agents' expectations and bring inflation to its target with little social costs. However, central banks that adopt inflation targets do not do so in the same way. They may use a different institutional design, governance structure, and way of conducting monetary policy. Therefore, the degree of autonomy of the monetary policy to set of the monetary authority to set the policy rates to control inflation depends on first the choice of the strategy to bring inflation to the target, and second on the transmission mechanism, which depend on several factors. So now connecting interest rates and the exchange rate. So we'll do this, bring the Mundell-Fleming model, and this model explains the connection between monetary policy and exchange rate. This model states that monetary autonomy would be an expected result for a small economy under floating exchange rate and free capital movement. The floating exchange rate regime would solve the impossible trilemma of economic policy, through which policymakers may simultaneously choose only two out of the following three goals: monetary independence, exchange rate stability, and financial integration. This conclusion is based on the interest rate parity theory of this exchange rate, where any difference between domestic and international interest rate implies a change in the expected exchange rate or the country risk premium. Assuming no change in the country's risk premium, the exchange rate should move to compensate for the investor's financial gains measuring the same currency. Thus, the interest rate parity equation establishes the relationship between monetary policy and international financial markets. And as long as monetary authority is willing to let the exchange rate bear the burden to promote the balance of payments equilibrium via adjustment of the current account, the theory assures that the monetary authority can keep its autonomy in setting the domestic interest rate aimed at price stabilization growth. Important to say that this reasoning assumes a continuous flow of foreign capital, consistent with the economy's balance of payment equilibrium. Nevertheless, in a hierarchical international monetary financial system, the monetary policy space is narrowed, and so the autonomy of peripheral economies to set the interest rate, to stabilize price and control aggregate demand is significantly constrained by free capital flows. Monetary authority may be prone to accommodate changes in the direction of capital flows using the interest rate differential to cool off inflationary pressures, for instance. So let's take the case of Brazil as an illustration. An increase in inflation expectations should lead to an increase in domestic interest rates. That's the first, as the top of the slide. What will then appreciate the currency. This will help, of course, to fight inflation, but will tend to deteriorate the current account. And of course, this is not a sustainable situation, and domestic currency will suddenly depreciate, and the central bank will have to increase interest rate again. Monetary autonomy is not observed as long as in the long run, neither price stability nor growth. So different from the conventional wisdom, the subordination of peripheral economies to the international liquidity cycle largely explains the connection between monetary policy and exchange rate movement in the short term. And it explains how there is no trend towards equalizing the nominal interest rate as assumed by the parity of interest rate theorem in a financially asymmetrical environment. In peripheral economies, narrowing the policy space implies that the exchange rate tends to be volatile and shows an appreciation trend in the long run, limiting growth and development. The presence of cost of Dutch disease, if not neutralized, reinforces the overvaluation trend of the real exchange rate. Now, I bring the empirical analysis. So how we manage to work with the statistical data. So the empirical analysis is divided in two parts. The first presents some core elements of the inflation target regime adopted by the select developed economies, the ones that are shown in the slides, and developing countries in Latin America. And the second part, we present an estimation of the real exchange rate trend for the two groups of countries. So here we have all the countries, and I will describe the columns. The first column, we list the countries and the dates of the adoption of the inflation target regime. So for developed countries in the late 80s and 90s, and for Latin America countries, the ones that are appointed as the red arrow, followed suit by conducting monetary policy in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s. The second column shows the objective of the monetary policy. All Latin America countries focus on price stability. The group of developed countries, that the ones with the blue arrow, The target of price stability is also accompanied by a commitment to maintain economic growth. The only exception in the list is South Korea, that's not pointed in blue. The third column is about the convergence horizon. Most countries adopt a medium-term convergence period between 2 or 3 years. Brazil is the only country that has an annual target as the convergence horizon. This implies that when the economy suffers shocks, the central bank needs to quickly react to them to reach the inflation target within the period established. The fourth column shows the definition of a specific target or band and the definition of the price index. All the selected countries use the consumer price index as a measure of inflation. The fifth column shows which institution determined the targets. In 5 of them, the inflation target established jointly between government and the central bank. In 8 of them, the central bank defines the inflation target, and in Norway and UK, the government alone is responsible for setting the inflation target. So now the procedures for the estimation of the undervalue index following Rodrigues' methodology. So to analyze the trend of the real exchange rate in the countries, use the exchange rate undervaluation index by Rodrigues. The author proposed the calculation of the undervaluation index in 3 steps. First step is to use data on the exchange rate and purchasing power parity to calculate the real exchange rate. That's the first equation. This means that when the real exchange rate is greater than 1, it indicates that the currency's value is depreciated, then more depreciated than indicated by PPP. Second step consists on considering the Hara-Balassa-Samuelson effect adjustment for the long-term productivity differential between high and low-income countries. This is done by regressing the real exchange rate on the GDP per capita. That's as indicated on the second equation. And last step is to estimate the Rodrigues undervaluation index, which is calculated by the difference between the real exchange rate and the estimated rate adjusted by the Hara-Balassa-Samuelson. That's in the third equation. So now we have here the results. The first block is for the Latin American countries, and the second block for developed countries. What calls attention in all of your graphs is that most Latin American countries follow a real appreciation trend of their currencies. We highlight with the red arrows 3 exceptions: the behavior of Mexico, Colombia, and Paraguay. In Mexico and Colombia, the deviation from the appreciation trend is observed in the final years of the series. And we interpret that this might reflect a shock effect. So it's not possible to confirm that these countries have reversed their long-term overvaluation trend. Mexico is the second one on the second column, and Colombia is the last graph on the first column. Even in case of Paraguay, that's is the third graph in the first column, a country where the deviation of the real exchange rate from equilibrium has been very close to zero, it's possible to observe the tendency of the exchange rate to appreciate in real terms. Regarding the second block of countries, developed ones all show a tendency to real exchange rate overvaluation. So here we put a puzzle. That's our question. Are such trends associated with their inflation target regime? And to answer this question, we test then our main hypothesis, that is, the overvaluation trend of developed countries' currencies is driven by the higher interest rate differential related to US. And the overvaluation trend of developed countries' currencies is not necessarily explained by the monetary regime, but by the high level of per capita income. So it's missing. There is a slide missing, but I can report about it. Because then what we did is to carry out a Granger causality test. And to do this, we calculated the average of the exchange rate misalignment, that's the undervalue index, and the productivity and the interest rate differentials in the two groups of countries. And for the group of developed countries, productivity Granger causes undervaluation. In the group of Latin America countries, it is the variation in the interest rate differential that temporarily precedes exchange rate appreciation. We also run we test with the Granger causality test in several formats, but also we had a special doubt if you should use average, but then we run the causality test for each country, and we reached the same result in a great deal. So we could, through the Granger test, confirm our hypothesis. So now, concluding, because our results, they have policy implications, and I mentioned that at the last slide. But then, summing up, the strategic goal of keeping a competitive real exchange rate for sustaining economic development and the catching up trajectory in developed countries, it's quite sound in theoretical and empirical literature in development economics. Yet, keeping a stable and competitive real exchange rate is not an easy task in a world of large capital movements. On one hand, the behavior of the world's interest rate movement is highly conditioned and determined by the tendency of the US Federal Reserve interest rate. Also, sudden massive capital outflows can arise in response to either the worsening of fundamentals or of an expected internal or external shock, followed by a sharp depreciation of developing country exchange rate. So, contrary to the Mandel-Fleming predictions, such depreciations generally translate into exchange rate overshooting that force central banks to increase interest rates to deter capital outflow and inflation pass-through. This is the proof that the central bank's autonomy to fix basic interest rate is just illusory. Continuing, we reaffirm then our analysis, with this analysis, the strategic role of keeping a competitive real exchange rate for economic development in peripheral countries. By dividing the select countries into two groups, developed and developed, we are able to test our central hypothesis. Developing countries tend to show an overvaluation trend of their currencies, driven basically by a higher interest rate differential related to the US in a context of high capital movement. Whereas in developed countries, the overvaluation trend is not necessarily explained by the monetary regime, but by their high level of per capita income, which reflects in turn the high average labor productivity. The results of the Granger causality test were straightforward. Although both select groups managed their monetary policy using the inflation target framework, in the group of developed countries, change in productivity temporarily precedes change in the real exchange rate, while in the group of Latin America countries, change in the interest rate precedes change in the real exchange rate. So my last slide. In the paper, we suggest some policy implications for developing countries under inflation targets. And the first one, that fixed an inflation target more compatible with structural economic conditions, not very low targets, pursuing both price stability and full employment instead of only an inflation target, enlarging the time horizon for reaching targets, and using a core inflation that captures the price trend and disregards disturbance resulting from temporary shocks. And last but not least, the recommendation to complement the toolkit by using ad hoc capital controls. So the empirical evidence presented in the paper show that the real exchange rate tends to appreciate, and despite its benefits for controlling price, the overvaluation can create many problems for developers. So thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Professor Kami. First, I have to apologize to you because since I'm the main organizer of the workshop, I have to talk with the staff about some organizational problems. And also, I was talking with the director of the Faculty of Economics about some internal problems that some internal problems that came again and again and have to be solved. And sometime in the future, I think that will be definitely solved. But I apologize for okay. So, but before we ask for questions of the audience, let me make some comments about your presentation. Yesterday, Onaran and Hagav made some comments about the question of the real exchange rate and development. And well, one interesting thing about your presentation is that you shows that the trend of overvaluation of exchange rates in developing and developed countries are caused by different causes. You know, it's very interesting. But and that to manage real exchange rate, we need some kind of capital controls. It's impossible to manage to have a competitive real exchange rate without some kind of capital controls. I completely agree with you. But one main criticism to neodevelopmentalism is the relation between real exchange rate and income distribution. The traditional argument is that, well, you people are defending the devaluation of real exchange rate. The devaluation of real exchange rate means the reduction of real wage. The reduction of real wage given productivity level of labor means a reduction in wage share. And the reduction in wage share is not only bad for workers, but also bad for aggregate demand, because we are considering the traditional Kalorian and Kalexkian hypothesis that the propensity to save out of profits is higher than propensity to save out of wages. So when the wage share is reduced, the consumption demand is also reduced. So even if it's possible to increase aggregate demand by a real exchange rate devaluation, it means by increasing net exports, there is a counterside effect that there is the reduction of consumption. Well, regarding this issue, I always argue that the idea that an overvalued exchange rate is a good thing for income distribution is basically nonsense, because an overvalued exchange rate means an unsustainable exchange rate. If the exchange rate is overvalued, which means that, first place, sooner or later there will be a balance of payment crisis. So when a balance of payment crisis, there always happens a huge depreciation of exchange rate. So to not devalue is not an option. It will be made in a planned way, or it will be made by the market. So that's the first argument. But the second argument is that an overvalued real exchange rate means that you have premature deindustrialization. Premature deindustrialization means that the labor force will be fired from the manufacturing sector that pays higher wages, and if they got a job in the formal market, they will get a job in the service sector that pays lower wages. So an overvalued exchange rate, because it make a regressive structural change, will reduce real wages in the medium to long term, basically because people have to migrate from higher wage jobs in the manufacturing industry to low wage jobs in the service sector, which in Brazil is a very low productivity sector. So hence the aggregate productivity of the economy shrinks. So real wages have also to decline. So there is not an option of not to have a competitive exchange rate. If you have an undervalued exchange rate for a very long period of time, you will get not economic development, not social justice, but you will have deindustrialization and reducing the real wages, which means that reducing the standard of living of the majority of the society. This is my comment. So we can open for questions. We have time. I have decided to transfer my lecture on the continuing course of neo-developmentalism to the afternoon, so we can have more time to discuss the excellent lecture of Professor Carmen Feijó. So now we open for questions. I think that I knew that. Oh no, gives her the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. When you were talking, I kept thinking, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? And it came at your very last slide when you talked about dual target for the central bank, accommodating monetary policy, and then capital controls. So hence my question, if you have ever tested the impact of capital controls on the exchange rate over or under appreciation in the context of inflation targeting. I mean, it might be difficult to answer that question econometrically because there is just so many capital controls, but Chile had them, Brazil had them at some late stage. So even from a not econometric but qualitative point of view, an analysis of that would be very interesting. And maybe also qualitatively, you said ad hoc capital control measures. So what do you have in mind? The usual suspects or something specific? And do we really have to stick with inflation targeting? If so, you're very, interesting to say it's a realistic inflation target. What is it for Latin America? I tend to say 4 or 5% for the UK, and a lot of new Keynesians, not to mix up with post-Keynesians, really raise eyebrows and they still want to stick with 2%. Credibility is very important. They keep saying, I mean, this is Paul de Grau, Charles Gujarat. On the record, I don't feel a problem in naming them because they have said it. Blanchard recently is tracked back from his 4% inflation target to 3% just last year, December. So what is a good inflation target? Do we have to have it? And what are the capital controls? And did it ever have any impact on underappreciation or appreciation?
Ok? Não, não, a gente coleta perguntas.
As Larry Summer already pointed, the
Beatriz, please present yourself first.
Hi, my name is Beatriz Plano Vieira. I am in the PhD. I enter now, and I am reading about developed economies and growth. And I would like thanks for the presentation, was great. And I will ask you about when we choose to integrate international, there is a loss of economic policy autonomy. This implies that the economy requires its freedom to implement countercyclical macroeconomic policy in name of the country to attract capital. Furthermore, the difficulty of control fiscal deficits in a stagnant economy fuels the financial sector's defense of the austerity policy, which have been implemented in Brazil since 2015. And the economy needs to regain dynamism, recording the investment rate. But considering that we export products with low income elasticity, how can we overcome this? Furthermore, at least, these policies require active government activity, which apparently will not happen with the new fiscal framework. So how to overcome so many obstacles?
Luis Fernando now.
Okay.
Luis Fernando do not deserve and do not need a presentation,
Okay,
but
thank you.
everybody knows him.
Well, first, congratulations for the presentation. Very interesting paper. I would like very much to read. And well, I have comments. It is about your slides that you put as an example the Brazil as the inflation target, and you conclude that because of the fact that you have capital mobility, you have inflation target in Brazil, have differential of interest rates, overvaluation, and well, and you conclude that there is no monetary autonomy. Well, I think that's a bit strong, a bit strong. Why? To say that there is no monetary autonomy. I would say reduce monetary autonomy, but not say my view, no monetary. For two reasons, main reasons. The first is the fact the huge foreign reserve accumulation that Brazil, the Central Bank of Brazil has. Compare over GDP, compare in Latin America is the highest. Brazil. And the second is the fact that since 2006, the Brazilian government reduced public external debt. And so the net balance in terms of foreign exchange changed from negative and become positive because the reserve is much higher than the external public external debt. So this is clear that in different occasions, the 2008 financial crisis, and during the period of instability of Dilma Rousseff impeachment as well, that In other occasion, we could have a speculative attack on the real. We didn't have this period. So just to think about. Finally, a small comments. Maybe I am a bit, I don't know, a bit concerned that you conclude that your econometric findings are the proof that you cannot implement, you should not implement undervaluated exchange rates. Well, econometric, you cannot say proof, right? It's a bit of precision, but
Illustrate.
there is no proof. There is no proof. Karen.
Illustrates.
There is evidence. There is evidence. But there is you'll find a lot of different proof on the other side. You always know this, that depends on the model that you use, the methodology that you use, parameters, and so on. Okay. But congratulations, very, very interesting findings that you have.
To Gabriel Palazzo.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Gabriel Palazzo from the University of Buenos Aires. And I'm very happy to be here because actually I'm going to present something related to this, and I'm working on this topic. So the first thing I have to say is I agree with you. It's a problem in inflation targeting, and it costs appreciation. But I have two comments. The first one is now you have another case that is the Argentinian case during 2016 until 2018 that we try to reduce inflation using inflation targeting and happen exactly what you said is going to happen. We have an appreciation of our exchange rate, then the deficit of current accounts increase, and then we have our debt crisis. So you have another case too. But the other thing that in terms of econometrics, I believe that it will be useful to compare what happened with other countries in Latin America that do not adopt inflation targeting, because during the 2000s, we also had the price commodity shock or boom that could appreciate all the currencies and doesn't matter the monetary regime. So maybe it could be interesting to look at them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now let's finish this first round of questions because there are too many questions. But before you answer, I just compliment Luis Fernando. Actually, what is the most precise way to speak about an econometric result is that the empirical results are not in discordance with your proposition. That's the best way to say. So, Carmen, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the questions. First, starting Professor Amaral. Yes, it would be very interesting to check on capital control and see how it would affect the trend of the exchange rates. We did not have anything done about that. That's actually this sort of exercise was our first comparing countries, and in this situation have been doing more work focused on Brazil. But I've read something, I think it's quite interesting, and I thank you very much for the suggestion. And about how much should be the targets? Yes, that's a big discussion in Brazil nowadays, no? Because our target is set very low, and we sorry, 90% now.
Inflation target. This year is 3.25%. 3 points, yes, but the inflation accumulated in 12 months is below 4%, so is very close to the target. But according to the central bank, there estimates for the inflation in 2023 are above 5%. So the problem is that the model of the central bank is a black box. You know, they say that they use a dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium model, so on and so forth. But the problem is that is nowhere in the site of the Brazilian Central Bank where you can find the model and to run the model if, in order to check if what the central bank says that it's true, it's really true. I also had already spoken to some senators that they have the prerogative to ask information from public institutions to open the model, because what is supposed to be done under the inflation targeting regime is accountability. So you have to be accountable. So that it's not possible that the Brazilian Central Bank simply hidden the model that it supposedly used to predict what is the required level of interest rate.
Yes, so 3.5, but it's being discussed to be reduced, and we believe that's a very conservative target for our history, and of course we understand that this kind of pressure to put such a low targets, it has political interest, and my suspicion that there is a clear capture of the central bank by the financial markets, and that's something that I think should be discussed as well.
Yes, it's a revolving door, actually.
Yes, yes, the expressions you like to use, revolving door, yes. And that's very clear. So something that, and you know that our president, he questioned that in the media, and it was fiercely attacked because what he's talking about something that is not of his specialty, and they have good technicians, but as Loureiro mentioned, they don't open the model, but you have to believe that they have the best model and they know what is best, but they don't show. So the inflation target here has been carried out very conservative, and I think this explains why you have still the highest interest rate in the world nowadays, the real one. And,
the real one, yes.
Yes, and
yes.
I since 1995, when the World Bank started showing the statistics for real interest rate in the world, at least the world development indicators, Brazil was in the top 5 since 1995. So it's something that there is no explanation in economic terms. You see why they have such a persistent high level of interest rate. And and I think that the political reasons, because you have a very financialized economy. And so that's another part of the explanation. What is your preferred target? No, for sure, 4% or 3.5% at least. That would be reasonable, I think. It would be a good signalization that you are pursuing price stability, but not suffocating the economy as you have been doing for decades. So that's why our economy has stagnated, in part because of this way of managing the monetary policy. And of course, that has a very heavy influence in the public debts. And then we close the cycle, the circle, and now have to contain your public spending, and you live in this crazy bubble. I think the bubble, they have to try to blow it. But that's what. Thank you very much. Yes,
Beatriz.
Beatriz, very difficult question. How you as I understood, you are worried about or concerned about how to find a way to overpass this our limitation in our exports. And that has to be, I think we should discuss in the toolkit, in the macroeconomic toolkit, also industrial policy. You see, and although we have been trying, had industrial policies tried in the past, but they did not show much results, and because there was a dichotomy between industrial policies aiming at increasing the value added of our production and so on, and also the macroeconomic policy with the high interest rate in the world, the depreciation trend of the exchange rate. So the conflict of interest, and also and that results in our stagnation. So to overcome this situation, you have to have another arrangement of macroeconomic policy. But how to flexible as it is, it's not easy. And I think there are lots of political issues also involved. I don't know if I capture everything that you mentioned, but that's what I'd like to add. And for Luis Fernando, I believe that, yes, I agree. You have some autonomy with the reserves. Actually, what we like to bring more in the paper is that part of the explanation, a great part of the explanation, is the way we open the economy, and we are subject to that hierarchical, we are competing hierarchical monetary system, financial monetary system, where peripheral economies are the basis. The currencies they have low liquidity, international liquidity, and that's an onus for the country that opens the capital account, the financial capital account, and to play in an international market, international financial market, in great disadvantage. And so the emphasis, there is no autonomy, because even to carry the high level of reserves can be seen as an onus for the country, because you pay, you lose, you have liquidity that has to be frozen just to face, just to defend yourself when you have a currency that's not convertible, and still you are in that game. So like to emphasize that. Perhaps in the paper should bring more the discussion of hierarchical monetary system, how this is the disadvantages for the peripheral economies. And in the inflation target regime just adds to more difficulty in that game. And although we have very high level of reserves, that has been a policy that has been adopted since the first Lula presidents, government. But also you are increasing a lot our international investment position. So in such a way, we are losing commands over the stock of wealth of the country. I see the reserve as a way of defending the currency. But even so, I believe that it's a very high cost, financial, fiscal cost for the country. And actually, it has short breath, I think. So we have been I see as an onus, not a bonus. Although I understand that strategically it's very important to have once you have opening the economy and I think no capital control, don't have any, or perhaps some kind of EOF.
Yes, I think we have some tax over financial operations, but it's very low, I think. It's not.
And let's remind us that you have a law that authorizes now, although it's not implemented, to open current accounts in foreign currencies that has already been approved, although not implemented. So a step forward in the direction of that integration with the international financial markets, but still in a very disadvantaged position. All that adds difficulty for us to develop, start developing trajectory. And Palacios, thank you very much for your comments. Argentina case, I should pay attention to that. Thank you very much. I will try to see your presentation. Yes, it's a very good idea to reproduce the exercise comparing our Latin America countries. We know inflation targets. Okay, thank you.
Okay, before we start another round of questions, I have just one comment that is can be interesting to Özlem. During the pandemic of COVID-19, the short-term interest rate in Brazil falls to just 2%, okay? But when it is in the, before that, when the short-term interest rate is in 3.5% per year, the president of central bank had a personal conversation with an owner of an investment bank, André Esteves, isn't it? Yes. Which is the owner of the BTG Pactual, is one of the biggest investment banks in Brazil. A phone call, and the president of the Brazilian Central Bank asks to him what should be, in his opinion, the lower bound for interest rate. Okay, this kind of conversation is absolutely illegal under Brazilian laws. So under my point of view, and I have told this to the finance minister, Fernando Haddad, the president of Brazilian Central Bank should be fired. Okay. But the government decided not to have such such a behavior. So, and that's why I think that this problem is demanding too much time to be solved, because the time to fire the actual president of the Brazilian Central Bank has already passed. So that's the question. So we have some more time for, please, Daniel.
Good afternoon. I'm Somesh from IIT Kanpur in India. I have a very basic question. in an econometric specification, wherein on the dependent variable, you have variability in exchange rate as a function of, as you said in one of the slides, differential interest rates, differential inflation rates, differential productivity, differential money supply. In the case of inflation targeting, does this specification change? Because countries which had adopted inflation targeting, right from New Zealand and India now, they claim that they use the Taylor's expansion. The Taylor's rule. That means they have output gap, they have interest rates, and they have inflation. So if they fix inflation, they have these two variables to change. That is interest rates and output gap. Does this age-old econometric specification change under inflation targeting? That's the question that
Yeah, in case of Brazil, I think in all Latin American countries, the targets all inflation. So they give less importance to the output gap. And they look at output gap, but they focus, the target is just inflation. But I believe they use some sort of Taylor rule. But as Orero mentioned, the model is quite secret. So in case of Brazil, I don't know about the others. If their model is open, the central bank, I believe.
Well, I think that, well, maybe Özlem know more about the European Central Bank model, but I think that the basic principle of inflation targeting is accountability. So in the transparency. So the model should be public knowledge, you know, it's public knowledge in Europe. Yeah, it's basic, you know, how can you discuss if the choice of monetary policy is right or wrong if you do not have the model? You have to believe in them. So it's an act of faith. We have to have faith on the president of the Brazilian Central Bank. Well, I have faith in God, but not in him. So I think that's a basic issue of public debate. Okay. Well, people, I think that we are sharp on time. We now ending this morning section of the third international workshop of the Structuralist Development Macroeconomics Research Group. I would give a thanks to Professor and my friend Carmen Feijó to give this wonderful lecture. And we will now go to lunch. And we restart at 3 p.m. local time. I have scheduled to deliver my the second class of my course on the morning, but since we have some delays, I will restart at 3 p.m. Brazilian time. So see you in 2 hours. Okay.